Our next reader is Myra Hargrave McIlvain. Myra is a teller of Texas tales. Whether she is sharing the stories in her books, her lectures, or her blog, she aims to make the Texas story alive. She has freelanced as a writer of Texas historical markers, written articles for newspapers all over the country, and for magazines such as Texas Highways. The Doctor's Wife is her 8th book, Another Texas Story. McIlvain lives in Austin with her husband Stroud. Her children are grown, and she enjoys the company of a house full of grands. Myra?
I have to hold mine up. I can't put it down. Okay. Chapter 1, November the 5th, 1845. Dear Papa and Helga, doors open and close. The ship's gangplank slid into the fog obscuring the Galveston dock. Amelia Anton scooped Frau Regina von Uhl up in her arms, practically carrying the grieving woman as they made their way down the narrow wood walkway onto the pier. Herr von Uhl ignored them both, shoving ahead to the waiting carriage. The hood of Amelia's cape protected her blonde hair, blonde braids from the chill, and offered a hidden place from which to stare at black men who appeared and disappeared into the mist, heaving bales of cotton off a nearby freight wagon. The heavy air muted their low work song, and sweat drenched their ragged clothing, even in the bone-aching cold. Southern slavery, as described in the immigrant guidebooks, had been one of her first lessons for her pupil, young Otto. The boy's papa, Amelia's turnip-shaped employer, clambered into the enclosed carriage without turning back to look for his wife, the dear lady responsible for Amelia being hired. Her reason for being in this strange land, as the boy's private tutor, died along with her student. Amelia, shuddering at the thought that she may have made a huge mistake, pulled her cape tight around her body and glanced through the back window of the carriage toward the mournful sound of slaves invisible in the white haze. The three of them rode in silence, squeezed into the lurching coach, its wheels making slushing sounds in the rutted street. Freight wagons clanked past, and coarse voices shouted commands in English. From under her hood, Amelia watched Herr von Uhl, aspiring merchant prince, staring sullenly at the faded, low-slung buildings, so different from his family's sprawling estate. Was he hating his older brother for inheriting the family fortune? For sending him to seek his own way in Texas? He leaned forward expectantly when the Tremont House, a broad white expanse hugging the mud street, loomed out of the fog. Black men dressed in spotless white uniforms stood on each side the double doors. Herr von Uhl, who had ignored Amelia throughout the 3-month ocean voyage, turned toward her. If they can't speak German, you'll have to get us registered. He bolted into the hotel, ignoring his wife. Dear Papa and Helga, all the months speaking English may be about to pay off. Amelia clenched her jaw and stepped from the carriage without waiting for von Uhl's instructions. She laid her hand on Frau von Uhl's shoulder as the doorman gently lifted the trembling woman from the carriage. Amelia, come talk to these people, von Uhl shouted. Please move, madam, into the hotel. She kept her voice low as she spoke to the doormen, who averted their eyes as though they were not aware von Uhl was stomping up and down the hotel's broad front porch. She lowered her head to avoid gazing like a peasant at the sprawling lobby, circled by thick white columns. Candles lit a large chandelier hanging from the high ceiling. She nodded to the doorman, who settled Frau von Uhl on a long red sofa. There you are, Stein, von Uhl bellowed. Tell these people who I am. Amelia turned to see Dr. Joseph Stein, the ship physician who had cared for Otto and for his mama, rushed through the hotel's broad front doors. I asked you not to leave the ship until I could join you." The doctor kept his voice low. His wiry black hair tousled as usual, his disheveled jacket hanging loose as he bent almost double to glare, eye level, at Herr von Yule. Amelia watched a thin man with slick black hair and a pencil-wide mustache rushing across the lobby, clasping his hands at his chest and nodding at the two men. "Pardon me, gentlemen. I'm Oscar Wilhite, manager of the Tremont House." Dr. Stein turned quickly and surprised Amelia by switching into perfect English. "We want to get Frau von Yule settled very quickly." Oscar Wilhite looked around like a man hoping something would happen to call him away from his difficult task. "Please explain to her husband that when a foreign ship comes in, we seclude our guests who are ill until we're sure they aren't carrying a contagious disease. You understand? It's just a precaution." Amelia was torn between feeling sorry for the manager and wanting to laugh as his eyes darted toward von Yule, pacing the lobby like an overheated bull. "An isolated room will be fine. Please place her husband in separate quarters." Dr. Stein's brows rose, commanding the hotel manager's understanding. "She needs rest. And send for a local doctor. I want to arrange for her care before my ship sails in the morning for Indian Point." Oscar Wilhite nodded, glancing toward von Yule. Then, holding his head high, eyes avoiding the little German's angry gaze, he fled toward a door leading off the lobby. Now, this is a time just a little later. She has passed away. Frau von Yule has passed away. I'm watching the time. The knock at the door that night was sharp, insistent, and well past the decent hour for an unannounced caller. Amelia held her candle high as she peeped into the narrow hallway. The yellow light from Herr von Yule's lantern made his smirk look almost menacing. His eyebrows rose sharply toward the smooth spot where hair had once grown. His pink jowls shook when he spoke. "My dear Fräulein Anton, I've borne the expense of your passage from Germany. With the loss of my son Otto, I no longer need your tutoring services. The passing of my wife has freed me of all my obligations to you. I've secured passage on a riverboat at daybreak for Houston. From there, I'm destined for my new mercantile business in the village of industry." Amelia leaned her slender frame against the door for support and stared down at the pudgy little man, trying to grasp what she was hearing. He held up one finger, indicating he had not finished. Do not give in to self-pity, my dear, for I have spoken to the manager of this fine hotel. You are young and strong and will be well received as a chambermaid." Sucking in his breath, which made his nostrils flare like bellows, von Yule waved the lantern toward a black man, more than a head taller than the German, standing in the shadows at rigid attention. She recognized the uniform of the Tremont House slaves. Light from the lantern made the man's black skin glow against his white linen jacket encrusted with gold epaulets. "This gentleman was kind enough to deliver my wife's travel trunk. You're a good fit for her clothing, even her slippers." Von Yule stroked his goatee-darkened chin. "I've left a token of my appreciation for your service." "A token?" Amelia was disgusted to hear the tremble in her voice. She cleared her throat, and in a rush of fury over being cheated out of what she was due, she held up her finger. "Sir, you hired me to tutor your son. You said 100 Prussian thalers a month and my keep." "I didn't listen when Papa reminded me that my teacher's pay was 400 thalers. I was willing to accept anything to avoid living like Helga. Besides, the articles in all the newspapers quoted our settlers raving about success in Texas. I did not claim my pay on shipboard or after we reached Galveston. I thought you were too burdened over Otto's death and report to the kitchen in the morning at 4:30. Good evening, Fräulein Anton, Amelia Anton. Do well in your new position." Wheeling away from her, Herr Gustav von Yule practically bounced down the hall, a man freed of his last burden. "Ma'am," the uniformed slave bowed toward the glimmer of Amelia's candle. He slid Frau von Yule's travel trunk into the room. His voice was deep baritone. "I'll come in the morning to move your trunk to our chambermaid's quarters." Amelia nodded. Was she supposed to curtsy? The slave bowed again. his face a blank slate as he backed into the darkness. Now I want to read one more little section. She married Dr. Stein very quickly. He came back, proposed to her. She married him just like that, and went with him to Matagorda Bay on the Texas coast, where there was just one house, and the place was called Indian Point. That later became Indianola, but this is the beginning, and it was called Indian Point. And she is there now. And this is right after she arrived. It's Christmas Eve. The evening sky was black, offering not a single star to guide the settlers' holy Christmas. A rich tenor voice began quietly. Then a chorus of male voices joined in, filling the air with still night. Adults and children began pouring out of the tents, holding flickering candles. Voices rose, drawing throngs onto the shore to join that heavenly sound. Candles glowing on the faces of smiling children, and tear-streaked adults shut out the sight of the dingy tents and the cactus-plagued prairie. Only the music and the voices mattered. They were home again. Then, like the crescendo of an organ in a great cathedral, thunder crashed and a streak of lightning lit the prairie, igniting a clump of cactus. The skies opened with a deluge of rain that snuffed out the candles and drove the shrieking sojourners to their only protection, the stinking, crowded tents. Amelia and Dr. Stein reached the cabin at the same time and slammed the door shut against the pouring rain. They had started pulling off wet coats and shoes when a loud knock startled Amelia. Dr. Stein stumbled in the dark to light a candle. A woman that Amelia recognized as one of the older passengers on the Neptune, who had been kind to Frau von Uhl after Otto died, stood on the step with rain drenching her wool shawl. Mud clung to her shoulder. I fell as I ran across the trail. Amelia pulled her into the cabin and helped remove her mud-smeared shawl. Dr. Stein introduced Frau Fischer and wrapped the cover from their bed around the shivering woman. I'm sorry to bother you. I don't know where to turn. My son Hans has been listening to Augustus Buchel talk about forming a military unit. He's saying the Victoria newspaper predicts war with Mexico as soon as Texas joins the United States. My Hans says he's going with Air Captain Buchel. Tears rolled unchecked down Frau Fischer's cheeks. Dr. Stein motioned for Frau Fischer to sit with Amelia on the new bed. He pulled his trunk around and sat on it, facing the two women. Buchel's had a lot of military training in France. He's been a mercenary in Spain. I'm not at all surprised that he's talking war to the young men. Dr. Stein, Hans is all I have left. I lost 4 precious babies before the Lord blessed me with that child. I sold everything and left Germany to keep him from serving in the army. The Hessens killed his papa. I don't want that for my Hans. When she reached for Dr. Stein's hand, rings sparkled on all her fingers. Several fingers were bulked with more than one large stone. You're respected among our young men. Tell them to remain here with their families. Dr. Stein leaned toward Frau Fischer. I'm sorry Buchel is frightening everyone with this war talk. He's taking advantage of the paper being printed in English, making it sound like the war is about to happen. The newspaper report says it'll take a while. Dr. Stein smiled. Meantime, maybe we can get a Sangerbund organized. I heard Hans' tenor tonight. He has a beautiful voice. I'll speak to him about getting something going. Dr. Stein's face lit with a broad smile. If we keep our young men occupied, military service won't look like the only option. When the roads dry up and the Verein get wagons in here and move you up to New Braunfels, Hans will see more hope for his future. By the time Frau Fischer left, she had stopped crying. The rain had stopped as well. You're a kind man, dear husband. No wonder they love you. Our numbers have reached over 2,200. Word came today that another 800 are waiting in Galveston. Hopelessness is sweeping like a plague through there. The men hate the place so much they won't work to improve it. I felt encouraged tonight when everyone was singing with such enthusiasm. Then the damn rain spoiled it all. He stretched out wearily on their new bed. This feels heavenly. The carpenters said you instructed them to make it extra long to fit my height.